da 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 ya ya da 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 da. It's so good to be back with you. It's always good to go away, and it's great to come back. Let's light up the darkness. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Tell you something. It seems like every day, more bad news, worse news. I'm really alarmed. I have a daughter in an American university. It's a terrible atmosphere on campus. The Jewish kids at college campuses right now are in fear. They don't know what's going to erupt next, where it's going to come from. We've had times where we've been, met with a lot of flagrant anti-Semitism, in America, obviously in many other countries as well. But not like this. It hasn't been like this. Actual Jew hatred, people feeling absolutely free to talk about killing Jews. And it's all based on lies, absolute lies about what is going on in the Middle East and why it's happening. It's not a political discussion. I just want to say, please, God, watch over the nation of Israel and everyone who loves the nation of Israel around the world. May we be safe, and may we continue to shine a light for the nations, to the nations, to be a light among the nations. This is what we're here for. Learning Torah, sharing Torah, setting an example. And if we want to make a claim, and we have a claim, a strong claim, the strongest, but as we've seen, God gave us the Holy Land to live in, if we would live according to God's law and perform our obligations. So please, God, strengthen Jewish people everywhere to perform their obligations as best as they can. If we're going to be a nation of priests, we have to behave like one. We absolutely have to behave like one. And that's not just talking about Israelis in Israel. That's all of us everywhere. Who's in the house on a Friday? Paul in the Great Northwest. Gordo in Scotland. I came home late last night. It was a long week. And I thought maybe I should just take another day off and start on Saturday night. But you know what? On Friday, I got my boys from Scotland, Gordo and John. It's so good to have you here with us. Joe in the Inland Empire, Karen in Northern California, Sharon in New Jersey, Renee in Indiana, Paula says sing it, Shandora in the Bronx, Al in North Carolina, John in Maine, Paul in Maryland, everybody. Awesome. And also Ella's in the house and Yitzhak in Minnesota. All right, let's do this. Okay, so where are we? Today we're going to do some, we're going to abbreviate a little bit so that we can get through 3 pages and, make an effort to get caught up. I think we're running 6 pages behind right now. And not only that, but on Sunday, I'll just tell you right now, Sunday I'm not going to be able to teach the class because we have an all-day training. It's amazing that we live in such times, but you guys have heard many times I'm in a security force called Maganam, and on Sunday we have all-day training with the same guy who trains SWAT for LAPD. And we just don't know where the danger is going to come from next, and we're doing our best to be prepared so that we can protect all Jews. Sometimes we serve with firearms, and sometimes we serve with Seforim, with books. Okay, so we are working our way through chapter 3 here in Tractate Kiddushin. The 20th volume of the Talmud. And we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 13. And the concept here is what happens to the status of the offspring of prohibited unions, right? So obviously the simplest case, If two Jews marry each other and they have a child, that child is a Jew. But if a Jewish woman married to a Jewish man has an affair with another Jewish man and produces a child of that adulterous union, sadly that child is a mamzer, who's only permitted to marry another mamzer, a very difficult status for a child to bear through no fault of his or her own, but is the product of a sin, a grave sin committed by the mother. There's other kinds of prohibited unions, like if a priest marries a divorcee, so his son is disqualified from serving in the temple. He's still a Kohen, but he's disqualified from serving, so he's known as a halal. He's definitely not a mamzer, according to the majority opinions. At any rate, Rabbi Kiva might argue with that. And these are the kinds of questions that we have been addressing. So we left off at the bottom of page 67b. We're going to do 68, 69, and 70 today, God willing. And we were talking about, right, Rabbi Yonah says, and some say it was taught by Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, that the verse states explicitly in the chapter dealing with forbidden relatives, right, relatives that you cannot marry because it would be incest. The product of incest is also a mamzer. Whoever shall do any of these abominations shall be cut off. Cut off means charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court. A shortened life. How much shorter? The sages debate that elsewhere. So in this verse, all those with whom relations are forbidden are juxtaposed to one another, and therefore also to a wife's sister, right? A man cannot be married to a woman, divorce her, and then marry that woman's sister. He would be permitted to the sister after his wife dies, even if they were already divorced, but not until then. So in this verse, all those with whom relations are forbidden are juxtaposed to one another and therefore also to a wife's sister. And then the question is, so this is somebody that you cannot marry. Well, what if you betroth her? Did you do anything at all? Or, in other words, if you are not allowed to marry someone, you're not allowed to produce children with somebody, what if you attempt to betroth them? Is that betrothal valid at all? Meaning that to break it off, you're not allowed to marry them, but before you're free to go your separate ways, you have to give a get just to end that betrothal because a betrothal took hold. Or if you can't marry someone, does the attempt to betroth produce nothing at all? It's as if you did nothing. So which they're wording here as betrothal is not effective, right? So just as betrothal is not effective in the case of a wife's sister, so too betrothal is not effective with regard to all those with whom marital relations are forbidden. So the Gemara asks, if so, that this law is derived from here. Oh, I see. This is where I'm picking up. I beg your pardon, but I'm not going to go into this because we're trying to do 3 pages today. I'm skipping forward a little bit to the top of page 68b, right? So the sages are deriving how we prove that betrothal does not take effect for all those relations. It is not effective for all those kinds of relations based on the fact that betrothal is not effective in the case of the wife's sister. Now, near the top of 68b, the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that betrothal not with an incestuous relative or with a wife's sister, but rather with a Gentile woman is ineffective, right? Under secular law, obviously, a Jewish man can marry a non-Jewish woman, but under Jewish law, he cannot. That is not a marriage that is recognized by Jewish law. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that betrothal with a Gentile woman is ineffective? And the verse states, neither shall you make marriages with them. Deuteronomy 7:3, which teaches that marrying Gentile women is halachically meaningless. According to Jewish law, it's meaningless. It's a non-concept. So the Gemara asks, we have found that betrothal is ineffective. Since you can't marry them, you can't betroth them. If you attempt to betroth, you did nothing at all. We have found that betrothal is ineffective with her. From where do we derive that her offspring is like her? Right. So under Jewish law, if a Jewish man attempts to marry a non-Jewish woman, he didn't do anything. Well, what if they produce a child? The child is like her, right? So the child of a non-Jewish woman is a non-Jew. How do we derive this? Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, as the verse states with regard to the same issue, your daughter you shall not give to his son, for he will turn away your son from following me, right? Your daughter you shall not give to his son, for he will turn you away from following me. So here we learn that a Jewish girl should not marry a non-Jewish boy. Now, since the verse is concerned that after one's daughter marries a Gentile, the father will lead his children away from the service of God, this indicates that your son, i.e. your grandson, from a Jewish woman is called your son by the Torah. But your son from a Gentile woman is not called your son, but rather her son. Ravina said, learn from it that the son of your daughter, born to a Gentile, is called your son in all regards. Right? So if a Jewish girl marries a non-Jewish boy, prohibited, not a valid marriage, but under Jewish law, but the child of a Jewish woman is a Jew. Not a mamzer Jew, but a full-fledged Jew, right? So the son of a Jewish woman or the daughter of a Jewish woman is a Jew. And that's what they're deriving here, right? Since the verse is... So Ravina said, learn from it that the son of your daughter born to a Gentile is called your son in all regards. And the Gemara asks, shall we say that Ravina holds that with regard to a Gentile or a Canaanite slave who engaged in sexual intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring is a mamzer? One can infer from the fact that the offspring of this union is called your son, that he is a Jew, and therefore the principle stated in the Mishna should apply. If a woman cannot join in betrothal with someone, then their child is a mamzer, as in the case of incest or adultery. But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Although he is not a fit offspring, he is also not a mamzer. Rather, he is merely called disqualified. Since betrothal is inapplicable to a Gentile is not included in the category of someone with whom a Jewish woman cannot personally join in betrothal, as no Jewish women can be betrothed to him. No Jewish woman can be betrothed to him. Nevertheless, as their child's birth is the result of a transgression, he is considered disqualified, meaning disqualified to marry a priest. Right? In all other regards, the child of a Jew is a Jew. So, of a Jewish woman. I'm sorry, to be clear. The child of a Jewish woman is a Jew, full-fledged, disqualified to marry a priest, but in all other respects, a Jew. Now, the Gemara asks a question with regard to Rabbi Yochanan's statement. That verse, neither shall you make marriages with them, is written with regard to the 7 nations of Canaan. From where do we derive that betrothal does not take effect with all the other nations in the world? And the Gemara answers, the verse states as a reason for prohibiting intermarriage, for he will turn away your son from following me, which serves to include all those who might turn a child away, no matter from which nation. So there you go. We skip forward a little bit now to page 69a and Mishnah number 14. Rabbi Tarfon says, mamzerim, right, plural of mamzer, can be purified so that their offspring will not be mamzerim, right? So a mamzer, a Jew who's the product of incest or adultery, is only permitted to marry another mamzer. How is it possible? And then their children are mamzers. So how is it possible that the offspring of a mamzer who's not permitted to marry any other Jew could become a full-fledged Jew who is not a mamzer? How is this possible? How so? With regard to a mamzer who married a Canaanite maidservant, right now we don't have this anymore because we don't have slavery anymore, but in the ancient world where slavery was incredibly common, a Canaanite slave actually had a greater status than a Gentile, in the sense that a Canaanite slave was owned by a Jewish family and actually had to observe certain Jewish laws, certain halachas that apply to the Canaanite slave, and they would become quite well versed in what it means to be a Jew and upon their release could quite easily become a full-fledged Jew. So how does this work? With regard to a mamzer who married a Canaanite maidservant, their offspring is a slave, right? She's not a full-fledged Jew. She's a Canaanite maidservant, so her offspring is a slave. If his master subsequently emancipates this boy, that son is found to be a free man rather than a mamzer. Rabbi Eliezer says this method is not effective as their son is a mamzer slave. But that seems to be the minority view. Now we skip forward because we've just finished chapter 3. And now we're going to go into chapter 4. And let me just read a few verses that are going to be relevant to this chapter the first two from Leviticus and the second two from Deuteronomy. Leviticus 21:7, they shall not take a woman that is a harlot or profaned, neither shall they take a woman divorced from her husband, for he is holy unto his God. Who are we talking about? A Cohen, a priest, of course. And also Leviticus 21:13 through 15. And he shall take a wife in her virginity, a widow, or one divorced, or a profaned woman, or a harlot. These shall he not take. But a virgin of his own people shall he take to wife, and he shall not profane his seed among his people, for I am the Lord who sanctify him. Now, of course, we're talking about a Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And not only is he not allowed to marry a divorced woman or a profane woman or a harlot of any sort, he's not even allowed to marry a widow. But what you also heard in that verse is that he shall marry a virgin. Now, that doesn't just mean that the only woman that he's permitted to marry is a virgin, but there's also a positive commandment that the Kohen Gadol be married. You can't have a Kohen Gadol who's single for various reasons, because when we read the law and we read this in Tractate Yoma, right, the law of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, bringing atonement on behalf of the nation during Yom Kippur, in those verses it says he shall atone for himself and his house. Right? And from that, the sages learned that he has to have a house, a household, and a man's house means his wife, right? It's not just some building, right? The house is the house of his family that he's building, and he has to be married. So that's a positive commandment in addition to the negative commandments of who he can't marry. Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and 4. A mamzer shall not enter to the congregation of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation shall none of his enter into the congregation of the Lord. An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation shall none of them enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. But Ruth was a Moabite. Ruth was a Moabitess, right? So female Moabites are able to enter the congregation of the Lord. Male Moabites are not. You shall not abhor an Edomite. Edom, right? Edom is named after Esau, Asaph, Jacob's brother. And that's why the Torah says, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian because you are a stranger in his land. The children of the 3rd generation that are born to them may enter into the congregation of the Lord. So you can have converts from the Egyptian. The 3rd generation are free to marry in the Jewish people. And interesting, you shall not abhor an Edomite. I mean, we understand, the sages understood that when you talk about Edom, right, what you're talking about is Rome. Right? The descendants of Asaph, right, of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, are basically understood to be the creators of Western civilization. There's going to be Greece, it's going to be Rome, it's going to be the whole Western civilization. And I'm sure Bill could tell us more about this, but I think this is understood to include the whole Christian world. And this idea, you shall not abhor, meaning you should not have enmity, right, with us and the Gentiles, especially with us and the Christian world. We are all, children of God, and specifically, right, we are monotheists, right, who worship the one God. And then just put aside, actual religious dogma. That's not a subject for this platform. We just talk about Judaism here. But, anyone who's sort of in that Western civilization who commits to observe the Noahide commandments, right, to live in a law-abiding society, not to curse God's name, not to perform idolatry, not to rape, not to murder, not to rob, and not to, tear a limb from a living animal to eat it, and is doing those things to honor God, we should be in an absolute pact of friendship and elevating the world together. Okay. 69a, chapter 4, Mishna number 1. There were 10 categories of lineage, with varying restrictions on marriage among the Jews who ascended from Bavel. So what we're talking about is the Jewish community in Babylonia, the part of it that returned to Israel at the end of the 70-year exile, right? So when the first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the Jews were exiled from the land. They were sent to the Babylonian Empire, which was quickly defeated by the Persian Empire, right? We remember that in the sort of philosophy of the sages, again, a much bigger topic than we're just going to allude to here in 5 seconds. But basically, in the philosophy of the sages, when the Jews suffer calamities, it's because we're not, as a nation, rising and living up to the spiritual level where we should be. And then, one of our enemies is going to be sort of empowered to strike us a blow, and sometimes a mighty blow. And that should always be a signal to us to elevate our level. Whenever we suffer calamity, we should do whatever we can to elevate our level as individuals and as a nation. So, our enemies can be empowered to strike a mighty blow on the Jewish people, but beware those enemies, because anyone who is used that way will not survive it. Right? All our enemies that were empowered at some point in history to strike a mighty blow on the Jewish people are gone, are dead and gone. And that's what happens to every civilization that rises up to destroy the Jews, as happened to Nebuchadnezzar, right? And that Babylonian community, they were quickly defeated by the Persians. And so Bavel, it's called Babylonia, but it became part of the Persian Empire. So 70 years after the destruction of the first temple, they were permitted by the Persian king to return and rebuild, and that project eventually produces the second temple, and we begin the second temple period. But what happened was that after that 70 years of exile and being so battered and beaten that Israel was utterly crushed and defeated when the first temple was destroyed, that now these exiles are returning and their spiritual level is very low. Now, it's a huge sort of Zionist project to return back to the Holy Land and rebuild the temple, reestablish Jewish practice, get the Kohanim doing the daily service in the temple, get the land planted and observing the Shemitah year, etc. Everything would be on a lower level than when the first temple got going. But they did their best. And so who was it that led them? It was Ezra. You read all about this in the book of Ezra. And there were the prophets of that period, which were kind of the end of the age of prophecy, like Nehemiah. Now, here's the point. When they came up from Babylonia to Israel, they had been so battered and defeated that a lot of distinctions within the population had become blurred. And that's what we're going to talk about here. There was a little bit of uncertainty of who was who, right? Who really was a priest? Who was a Levite? Who was a Yisrael? Who are the mamzers in the group? Who are the Gideonites? Who's permitted to marry who, and who is going to act as a judge and draw those distinctions and help the people know who is permitted to marry who. So there were 10 categories of lineage when the Jews ascended from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael with Ezra before the building of the second temple. And they are as follows: priests, Levites, and Israelites, priests who were disqualified due to flawed lineage, chalalim, converts and emancipated slaves, mamzerim, Gibeonites, i.e. the descendants of the Gibeonites who converted in the time of Joshua, and children of unknown paternity, right? Children who didn't know who their father was, known as shituki, and foundlings, children who didn't even know who their mother was, like actual babies that were found sort of like, on the doorstep of a Jewish family. Well, who are they really? We're not even sure if it's a Jew, and we certainly don't know who the mother is and who is the father. So what do we do with such a person? The Mishnah proceeds to detail the laws of these various groups. So with regard to priests and Levites and Israelites, it is permitted for men and women in these categories to marry one another. With regard to Levites who are not priests, Israelites, halalim, right, disqualified priests, converts, and emancipated slaves, it is permitted for men and women in these categories to marry one another. With regard to converts and emancipated slaves, mamzerim and Gibeonites, children of unknown paternity, shituki, and foundlings, it is permitted for all of the men and women in these categories to marry one another. So very interesting, because an emancipated slave is a Jew who's permitted to marry a mamzer. So what is the child of that union? Is it a mamzer or not? Right, that's a question we'll address. We kind of touched on that already, but we'll touch on it more deeply. And these are the last two categories. A shituki is any person who knows the identity of his mother but does not know the identity of his father. And a foundling is anyone who was collected from the marketplace and doesn't know the identity of his parents, neither that of his father nor that of his mother. These two categories are people whose status is uncertain, so they may be mamzerim. We're not sure, but they might be. Abba Shaul would call a shituki by the label of beduki, and we'll see why. Now, the Gemara, the Mishnah teaches there were 10 categories of lineage among the Jews who ascended from Bavel. So the Gemara asks, why does the Tana, the rabbi of this Mishnah, specifically teach the phrase ascended from Bavel? Why was it important for the Tana to specify their place of origin? Let him teach that they went to Eretz Yisrael. What difference does it make where they came from? And the Gemara answers, he teaches us a matter in passing, as it is taught in a Baraisa. The verse states, and you shall arise and go up to the place that the Lord your God shall choose. And this teaches that the temple is higher than all of Eretz Yisrael, which is why the verse speaks of ascending from the cities of Eretz Yisrael to the temple. And it teaches that Eretz Yisrael is higher than all of the lands. Is Eretz Yisrael a suburb of Nepal? No, it's obviously not the highest in altitude above sea level, but is the highest place on earth in terms of spiritual elevation. Jerusalem is the highest place on earth in terms of spiritual elevation, and the Temple Mount is the highest place in Jerusalem. Right. And it teaches that Eretz Yisrael is higher than all of the lands, as we explained. Now, the Gemara asks, granted, the temple is higher than all of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And this is derived from that which is written, now we're on 69b, matters of controversy within your gates, and you shall arise and go up to the place that the Lord your God shall choose. This is Deuteronomy 17:8, indicating that the temple, the place that God chose, is higher than all the other cities in the land of Israel. From where do we derive the claim that the land of Israel is higher than all other lands? And the Gemara answers, as it is written, therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when they shall no more say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but rather they will say, as the Lord lives, who brought up and who led the seed of the house of Israel out of the north country and from all the countries where I had driven them. This is Jeremiah 23:7-8. This is a very messianic passage, right? The day will come when the Jews will not just have been brought out of Egypt 3,000 years ago, but rather all the Jews will be brought up out of all the lands in the world. And what are they? Are they brought in? No, they're brought up. And that's why the land of Israel is spiritually higher than all other lands. The Gemara asks, if that is what the Mishnah wants to teach, why does the Tana specifically teach ascended from Babylonia, from Bavel? Let him teach ascended to Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara answers that the wording of the Mishnah supports the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. As Rabbi Elazar says, Ezra did not ascend from Bavel until he made it like fine flour, free of bran. In other words, he ensured that the lineage of those remaining was unsullied and selected all of those in Bavel who were of questionable lineage, and then he ascended with them to Eretz Yisrael. And you're like, wait, what? Wouldn't Ezra, who's now engaged in this project of rebuilding Israel and reestablishing the temple and getting the daily service of the priests and the sacrifices going again, who's he going to bring with him out of the Jewish community in Bavel? He's going to take all the people whose lineage is clear, so that he can make sure that he can establish people with marriages who are all permitted marriages, and all the people in Israel would have, clear, distinct lineage. But that's not what it says. What it says is he takes all the people of questionable lineage with him up to Eretz Yisrael, and he leaves the ones which are clear in Bavel. Why would he do that? Says Rav Steinsaltz, why did Ezra not do the opposite and bring to Eretz Yisrael only those of unflawed lineage, leaving behind those of flawed lineage? And Rashi explains that since the leading Torah scholars of the time ascended to Eretz Yisrael, Ezra relied on them to keep track of the different types of lineage. Consequently, he was concerned that if those of flawed lineage were left in Bavel, they would marry those to whom they were forbidden. Rabbeinu Yehonasan of Lunel similarly writes that Ezra relied on the authority of the courts in Eretz Yisrael to properly supervise marriages. Rabbi Meir ben Shmuel explains that Ezra was not worried about improper marriages in Eretz Yisrael due to the divine presence, holiness, and wisdom that rest there, whereas in Bavel, errors were likely to result. Other commentaries suggest an entirely different explanation. The families of unflawed lineage refused to go to Eretz Yisrael out of either fear of the enemies found there or worry over their livelihood, which was secure in Bavel. The families of flawed lineage were more amenable to moving to a new place. And you got this picture that's not so vastly different from the modern world, right? They were creating or recreating, right, the Holy Land in Zion, the Holy Land in Israel, which had been stripped of Jews by an enemy invader, colonizer, right? Which was the Babylonians led by Nebuchadnezzar. And now they're going to reestablish Israel. And who was willing to go on that, that adventure, that journey, that incredibly difficult task of resettling the land as a Jewish nation? Who was willing to make that move? It wasn't the people who were rich and doing great in Bavel, where they had really established a very strong community. And don't forget that, the community in Babylonia stays in Babylonia. I mean, a lot of Jews went with Ezra. It was something like 50,000 in the ancient world. And from that, flourished the whole Second Temple period. And then there was travel back and forth. And a lot of people sort of let the early pioneers do the heavy lifting. And then they came later. But that Babylonian community remained strong. And thank God it did, because later, after the Greeks were replaced by the Romans, in Israel, and an oppression became very severe, and many sages were killed, and Torah learning was shut down, and the Jerusalem Talmud was never finished. It was those very strong Jewish communities and Jewish academies in places like Pumbedisa and Hardea, Mechoza, over there in Bavel, which is part of the Persian Empire, that really enabled and protected Torah learning and the Babylonian Talmud that we are studying here. It was stated that Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, who were living over there in Bavel, had a dispute with regard to this matter. Abaye said, we learned in a Mishnah that there were 10 categories, in the Mishnah, this Mishnah that we're talking about, that there were 10 categories of lineage among the Jews who ascended, meaning that they ascended of their own accord. And Rava said, we learned that Ezra brought them up there against their will. And the Gemara explains, and they disagree about the statement of Rabbi Elazar. As Rabbi Elazar says, Ezra did not ascend from Babylonia until he made it like fine flour, and only then he ascended. Abaye does not accept the statement of Rabbi Elazar, since he maintains that they ascended of their own free will, whereas Rava does accept the statement of Rabbi Elazar. Or, if you wish, say that everyone accepts the statement of Rabbi Elazar, and here they disagree with regard to this. One sage, Abaye, holds that Ezra first separated the members of the community with flawed lineage, and they subsequently ascended to Eretz Yisrael out of their own desire. And the other sage, Rava, holds that he brought them up against their will. So the Gemara asks, granted, according to the one who says that the Mishnah means that they ascended of their own accord, without any distinction between the types of people who came, this is the reason that Rav Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, the lineage of residents of all lands is muddled compared to that of Eretz Yisrael. And the lineage of residents of Eretz Yisrael is muddled compared to that of Bavel. As the people came of their own accord, there was a lack of oversight concerning who married whom. But according to the one who says that he brought them up, and Ezra identified and selected all those who came with him, the sages of the time knew the lineage of all who came and would have been careful not to allow any forbidden marriages. So why is the lineage of the residents of Eretz Yisrael considered to be muddled compared to that of Babylonia? And the Gemara answers, though the status of those who came was known to that generation, it was not known to other later generations. Again, you always have that, sadly, that spiritual level descending, as people become assimilated and don't listen to the sages and marry who they want to marry. And then you have prohibited marriages taking place. Now we're going to skip a few paragraphs on 69b, and we're going to pick this up on page 70a. Now, the Mishna teaches, our Mishna teaches, that converts and emancipated slaves ascended from Bavel. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? And Rav Chisda says, as the verse states, with regard to the eating of the Pesach, right, the Paschal lamb that you eat on Passover, with regard to the eating of the Paschal offering, could be a goat also, upon the return to Eretz Yisrael, right? So you can only bring the Pesach, right? Bring the offering that is the Pesach when the temple is standing, so that it can be slaughtered in the courtyard, some of its blood sprinkled on the altar, and then the group that has registered to eat that lamb together or that goat together will eat it in Jerusalem, as we talked about in Tractate Pesachim. So, from where do we derive this? Rav Chisda says, as the verse states with regard to the eating of the Paschal offering upon the return to Israel of the exiles, right? In Ezra 6:21, it says, quote, and the children of Israel who had come back from the exile ate, and all such as had separated themselves to them from the impurity of the nations of the land to seek the Lord, the God of Israel, they did eat, indicating that converts and emancipated slaves who had abandoned the impurity of the nations of the land, meaning idolatry, joined Ezra, right? So you had converts or people who, back then, the alternative to Judaism was idolatry. There was no other monotheistic religion. So people who turned their back on idolatry and joined the Jewish people came with Ezra. So there were converts there. And you had emancipated slaves, again, who, they became Jews, not through the process of simply converting, but of being a slave to a Jew and then being freed from that slavery and now choosing to be Jews. So about them, we learn. The Mishnah taught that mamzerim, right? So that's how we know that converts and freed slaves were there. How do we know that there were mamzers in this group? The Mishnah taught that mamzerim were among those who ascended from Bavel. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? So the Gemara answers, as it is written, Nehemiah 2:19, and Sanballat the Oronite, and Tobiah, right? And Tobiah, but we'll just say with English, Tobiah, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard. And elsewhere it is written with regard to this Tobiah the Ammonite, for there were many in Judea, sworn to him because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son Yehohanan had taken the daughter of Meshulam, the son of Berechiah. That's Nehemiah 6:18. So the Gemara explains, this Tana holds that in the case of a Gentile or a slave who engaged in sexual intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring is a mamzer. That's according to the minority view. So since Tobiah the Ammonite, a Gentile, married a Jewish woman, as did his son, there were clearly mamzerim among those who ascended. Now that's according to the view that if a Jewish woman has a child by a Gentile, the child is a mamzer. And the Gemara says, well, this works out well according to the one who says that in that case like that, the offspring is a mamzer. But according to the one who says that the lineage of the offspring is unflawed, right, that the child of a Jewish woman that she has by a Gentile is a Jew and is unflawed. It's disqualified to marry a priest, but that child is a full-fledged Jew, not a mamzer. So according to that view, which is the majority view, that's the law, so then according to that view, how can you say that there were mamzers? We don't have a proof yet that there were mamzers among the exiles who returned with Ezra. So what can be said? And furthermore, from where is it clear that Yehohanan had offspring from his wife? Perhaps he did not have offspring. And it is possible that there were no mamzerim in this group. And furthermore, even if they did have offspring, from where is it clear that they had offspring here in Bavel, who then ascended to Eretz Yisrael? Perhaps they were there in Eretz Yisrael all the time, as they may have been one of the families that was not exiled to Bavel, and therefore they cannot be used as the proof that mamzerim ascended from Bavel. And from this you learn, we've said it before, while the nation was exiled to Bavel, there were some small group, much smaller than the whole nation, but there was, a significant number of Jews who never left, right? And that's why it's important in modern times to always remember this. Jews have lived in the land of Israel continuously for over 3,000 years. There was never a time since the Jews came out of Egypt through the desert and Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land, that there were no Jews living there. There's been a continuous Jewish presence, particularly in Jerusalem and some other cities, for all this time. And so perhaps there were mamzers in Israel in that community that never left. How do you know, since we're just deriving everything, that mamzers came up within the group of exiles with Ezra from Bavel? So rather, the proof that mamzerim were among those who ascended from Bavel is from here. Nehemiah 7:61, chapter 7, verse 61. And these were they that ascended from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, and Immer. But they could not tell their fathers' houses, nor their offspring, whether they were of Israel. The Gemara explains that these names are to be interpreted like this. Tel Melah, these are people whose licentious actions were similar to the act of Sodom, which was turned into a mound of salt. Tel Melach. Tel Harsha, this is referring to one who calls a man father and his mother silences him, as the word Harsha is similar to Mecharishto, meaning silences him. Right? In other words, he thinks he knows who his father is. His mother says, don't call him your father, meaning she knows that that man is not the boy's father, and she doesn't know who the father is, presumably. Or at least is not telling. In any event, the statement that there were those who acted licentiously, as did the people of Sodom, means that there were mamzerim among them. Right? Licentious like Sodomites is referring to the fact that they practiced adultery regularly, and that's why there were mamzers among them. So the Gemara continues with this explication of the verse, but they could not tell their fathers' houses, nor their offspring, whether they were of Israel. This is referring to a foundling who is gathered from the marketplace, right? A baby, and it's unknown who the mother or father were. Such a person does not even know if he is Jewish, as he has no knowledge of his parents. With regard to the names Cherub, Adon, and Immer, Rabbi Abahu says that these terms should be expounded as follows. The master, Adon, meaning God, said, I said that the Jewish people shall be as important before me as a cherub, right? Who is a warrior angel, not a cute baby. But they made themselves impudent as a leopard, namer. There are those who say a different version. Rabbi Bahu said, the master, Adon, said that although they made themselves as a leopard, namer, they remain as important before me as a cherub. And just let's just keep going. Now, explicating the same verse, Rabba Bar Bar Chana says, in the case of anyone who marries a woman who is not suited for him to marry due to her lineage, the verse ascribes to him blame as though he plowed, charash, all of the entire world and sowed it with salt, melach, as it is stated with regard to those of flawed lineage who ascended from Babel, and these were they that ascended from Tel Melach, Tel Harsha. So Rabba Bar Ravada says that Rav says, in the case of anyone who marries a woman of flawed lineage only for the sake of money, he will have offspring who will act inappropriately, as it is stated. They have dealt treacherously against the Lord, for they have begotten strange children. Now shall the new moon devour them with their portions. Rabba Bar Ravad explains the verse, and lest you say that at least the money that they received as a dowry was spared, although they suffer from the acts of their offspring, the verse states, now shall the new moon devour them with their portions, meaning their property shall be consumed in a single month. And this is the same idea as don't marry for money, because if you do, you'll pay for it every day. People who are going to take on a marriage that is prohibited by Jewish law because they're going to, marry into some money, that money won't last. And lest you say this will occur after a long time, but in the interim he will benefit from the money, the verse states, the new moon. And the Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred that their money will be lost immediately? Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, a month comes and a month goes and their money is already lost. In any event, the fact that the punishment they receive is loss of their portions indicates that the sin in this case was marrying for the sake of money. And Rabba Bar Ravada says, and some say Rabbi Salah says that Rav Hamnuna says, in the case of anyone who marries a woman who is not suited for him to marry due to her lineage, Elijah, the prophet Elijah, binds him in that manner that those liable to receive lashes are bound. And the Holy One, blessed be he, straps him. Remember that Elijah, Eliyahu, never died, right? Elijah ascended, and that's why often in the Talmud it comes up that Elijah comes back and, reveals information or takes some kind of an action, acting sort of as an instrument of God to do that. And a sage taught concerning all of them, Elijah writes, and the Holy One, blessed be he, signs the following decree. Woe to he who disqualifies his offspring and who brings a flaw to his family lineage and who marries a woman who is not halachically, by Jewish law, suited for him to marry. Elijah binds him, and the Holy One, blessed be he, straps him. He further said, and anyone who disqualifies others by stating that their lineage is flawed, that is a sign that he himself is of flawed lineage. Another indication that one's lineage is flawed is that he never speaks in praise of others. And Shmuel says if one habitually claims that others are flawed, he disqualifies himself with his own flaw. The flaw he accuses them of having is in fact the one that he has. When you hear somebody continuously criticizing others for having a particular flaw, take a second look at the person who keeps making that accusation. Now, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're going to go into an incident, somewhat lengthy, so I'll just read fast, but it's all one incident involving Rav Yehuda, the sage of Nehardea. So, there was a certain man from Nehardea who entered a butcher shop in Pumbedisa. And he said to them, give me meat. And they said to him, so Rav Yehuda lived in Pumbedisa, but this man was from Nehardea, right? And the action is going to be moved to Nehardea shortly. So, there was a man from Nehardea and he enters a butcher shop in Pumbedisa. And he said to them, give me meat. And they said, well, wait until the servant of Rav Yehuda bar Yecheskel has taken his meat, and then we will give it to you. Meaning this guy arrogantly said, hey, I want the best meat in the shop. And they said, well, we always save the best meat in the shop for the big sage in our city, who is Rav Yehuda. So when his servant comes, we give him the best cut, and then you can go after that. So this arrogant man says to them in the butcher shop in anger, who is this Yehuda bar Shaviskel? Instead of Yecheskel, meaning he's making fun of Rav Yehuda's name, and he's making a derogatory name for a glutton of meat. So this guy says, who is this Yehuda bar Yefishsekel, that he should precede me, and that he should take before me? So they went and told Rav Yehuda what the man had said. And Rav Yehuda excommunicated him in accordance with the law of one who disparages a Torah scholar. You don't publicly mock a Torah scholar, or you're going to be excommunicated from the Jewish community. So they also said to him that the same man was in the habit of calling people slaves, right? This is something like an insult that he would just throw off at people. So Rav Yehuda proclaimed about this man that he is a slave, and therefore he's disqualified to marry a Jew. Now the Gemara continues the story. So that arrogant man went and summoned Rav Yehuda to judgment before Rav Nachman, who was a judge in Nehardea. The guy was from Nehardea, so he went back to Nehardea, and he went and complained to Rav Nachman that this Yehuda guy in Pumbedisa had excommunicated him and publicly proclaimed that he's a slave without even meeting him. Right? So he goes to Rav Nachman and complains. When the summons arrived in Pumbedisa, right? So evidently Rav Nachman didn't know which Yehuda was being referred to. What he heard is that some Torah scholar in Pumbedisa had declared this man who had come before him excommunicated and publicly proclaimed as a slave without even meeting him. So Rav Nachman says, you can't do that. So he summons Yehuda to come to his court. Now, when Rav Yehuda, who's the leading sage of Pumbedisa, is summoned to somebody else's court, he is, taken aback. And but he's being summoned by a rabbinic court. So what should he do? So he goes to see his colleague Rav Huna. And he says to Rav Huna, should I go or should I not go? So Rav Huna says to Rav Yehuda, well, as for the obligation to go, you're not required to go, since you are a great man, and therefore you are not under the jurisdiction of Rav Nachman in Nehardea. But Rav Nachman in Nehardea is married to a woman named Yalta, who is of the house of the exilarch. Right? The exilarch is the head of the Jewish community in Bavel. So it's sort of like the king of the Jews in Bavel. Right? We've talked many times about the exilarch. And the house of the exilarch, they were Torah scholars too, but they're of tremendous dignity. They're the descendants of the Nasi, right? So this is the head of the Jewish community, and you don't just take that lightly. So since this Rav Nachman has married into the house of the exilarch, and now he summoned you, you should go in order to honor the house of the exilarch. So you should go. So Rav Yehuda went, and he arrived in Nehardea, and he found Rav Nachman constructing a parapet, right? A little railing around the roof of the house, which is something that we have a mitzvah. It's a commandment to have a guardrail around the roof of a home so a person should not fall off. That's actually in the written Torah. So Rav Yehuda said to Rav Nachman, now that he sees, right, that he's been summoned to this great Torah scholar, Rav Nachman, and when he finds him, the guy's doing manual labor. So Rav Yehuda says to Rav Nachman, does the master not hold in accordance with that law that Rav Huna bar Idi says, that Shmuel says, once a person has been appointed a leader of the community, he is prohibited from performing labor in front of 3 people, so that he not belittle the honor of his position. Once you're at that level, you maybe at home in front of your family, you can fix, a light switch or something, but publicly you don't do manual labor. So Rav Nachman said to him, Oh, it is merely a little fence, gundarita, that I am constructing. Rav Yehuda said to him, is the term ma'ake, which is written in the Torah for guardrail, for this parapet, or the corresponding term mechitza, which the sages said? Is this term distasteful to you? Right? What he's saying now, he's going to challenge him over and over again that Rav Nachman, who's married into the family of the exilarch, doesn't speak the same Hebrew or Aramaic, neither as the sages nor as the common people. It's like they have their own highly refined, sort of overly elegant language that they use in the home of the exilarch. And he says, well, it's nice that they talk that way in the house of the exilarch, but when you're in public or talking to other sages, are you putting on airs that you use these highly refined words rather than the words that the sages normally use? So he says, are these terms, ma'ake and mechitza, distasteful to you? Now, during their meeting, Rav Nachman said to Rav Yehuda, let the master sit on the bench, which he called a karfita. So Rav Yehuda said to him, is the term safsal, which the sages said, or the term itzteva, the word itzteva, which the common people use? Are these words distasteful to you? Why are you using uncommon terms? Rav Nachman said to him, let the master eat a citron, right? An esrog, but he called it an etronga. And Rav Yehuda said to him, this is what Shmuel said. Anyone who says etronga demonstrates 1/3 of a haughtiness of spirit. Why? You should either say etrog, as the sages called it, or etroga, as common people say in Aramaic. Saying etronga is a sign of snobbery, as it was employed by the aristocratic class. He subsequently said to him, let the master drink a cup anbaga of wine. Rav Yehuda said to him, can you not say asparagus like the sages, or anpak like the common people? Later on, Rav Nachman said to him, let my daughter Donag come and pour us drinks. Rav Yehuda said to him, this is what Shmuel says, one may not make use of a woman for service such as this. Rav Nachman replied, she is a minor. Rav Yehuda retorted, Shmuel explicitly says one may not make use of a woman at all, whether she is an adult or a minor. Meaning, you don't want to have interactions with women where there's going to be any level of intimacy at all, because it leads to looks and touches and thoughts that are unseemly, particularly for Torah scholars. Later on, Rav Nachman suggested, well, let the master send greetings of peace to my wife Yalta, right, who's the actual member of the exilarch's household. Rav Yehuda said to him, this is what Shmuel says, a woman's voice is considered nakedness, and one may not speak with her. Rav Nachman responded, it is possible to send your regards with a messenger. Rav Yehuda said to him, this is what Shmuel says, one may not send greetings to a woman, even with a messenger, as this may cause the messenger and the woman to relate to each other inappropriately. Rav Nachman countered by suggesting that he send greetings by him, with her husband, right? By himself, Rav Nachman. I'll bring your greetings to her, which would remove all concerns. Rav Yehuda said to him, this is what Shmuel says, one may not send greetings to a woman at all. Now, Yalta, who was listening to this whole conversation between her husband, Rav Nachman, and Rav Yehuda, sent a message to her husband saying, release him and conclude your business with him so that he not equate you with another ignoramus. In other words, Rav Yehuda is showing Rav Nachman over and over and over again that, Rav Nachman is knowledgeable, but Rav Yehuda is the greatest sage of the generation who had all the teachings of Rav and Shmuel at his fingertips. And the reason he's acting this way, because it's not that Rav Yehuda is a snotty guy who wants to make Rav Nachman feel bad about himself. What he's saying is, you should not have summoned me to your court. You might have invited me to have a discussion. You don't send a summons to me, right? It's like one Supreme Court justice sending a summons to another Supreme Court justice. That's not the way things are done. And now Yalta is saying, yeah, you messed up, Nachman. Don't engage this guy in this manner. Let's just get this business done so he can go on his way. So, desiring to release Rav Yehuda, Rav Nachman said to him, what is the reason that the master is here? And Rav Yehuda said to him, because you sent me a summons. Rav Nachman said to him, well, now that I have not even learned from the master's form of speech, as you have demonstrated your superiority to me by reproving me even over such matters, How could I have sent a summons to you, to the master? They call each other the master. So Rav Yehuda removed the summons from his bosom and showed it to him. And while doing so, Rav Nachman didn't realize who he was summoning, obviously. He was just summoning the person who had excommunicated and called that arrogant guy a slave. So now he's realizing that who he has summoned and what's going on. So Rav Yehuda removed the summons from his bosom and showed it to Rav Nachman. While doing so, Rav Yehuda said to him, here is the man and here is the document. So Rav Nachman said to him, okay, well, since the master has come here, why don't let him present his statement in order that the people should not say that the sages flatter one another, right? Rav Nachman is saying, okay, I shouldn't have done it this way, but now that you've been summoned and people know you've been summoned, let's just hear the case, because if I just let you go because you're the great Rav Yehuda, then people will say that the sages don't examine one another, they just do each other favors, and that's why, the case was never heard. So let's actually go through the case. So Rav Nachman commenced the deliberation and said to Rav Yehuda, what is the reason that the master excommunicated that man? And Rav Yehuda replied, he caused discomfort to an agent of one of the sages, right? My agent who was at the butcher store to receive my meat from me, that this man wanted to cut in front of. If so Rav Nachman challenged this answer. Well, if so, let the master flog him, as Rav would flog one who causes discomfort to an agent of the sages. Rav Yehuda responded, I punished him more severely than that. Rabbi Yehuda held that excommunication is a more severe punishment than flogging. Rabbi Yehuda said that, who was a Tana of the Mishna. Rav Yehuda, who's an Amora of the Gemara, is citing Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Nachman further inquired, well, what is the reason that the master proclaimed about him that he is a slave? And Rav Yehuda said to him, because this man is in the habit of calling people slaves. And it is taught, anyone who disqualifies others by stating that their lineage is flawed, that is a sign that he himself is of flawed lineage. Another indication of his lineage being flawed is that he never speaks in praise of others. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. People who do not get in the habit of praising others, there's something wrong with them. And Shmuel said he disqualifies with his own flaw, right? What he says is wrong in others, it's exactly that which is wrong in him. So Rav Nachman answered, well, you can say that Shmuel said this law only to the degree that one should suspect him of being of flawed lineage. But did Shmuel actually say this ruling to the extent that one could proclaim about him that he is of flawed lineage? If somebody goes around challenging the lineage of everyone else, and specifically by calling them slaves, Rav Nachman is saying Shmuel must have ruled that that's a person we should be suspicious of his lineage. Perhaps he is a slave or the descendant of slaves. But are we going so far as that anyone who goes around calling other people slaves, meaning flawed lineage because they are slaves or descendants of slaves, that we just now can say publicly about them, no, that person is a slave because he goes around calling others slaves? Did Shmuel really say that? So the Gemara continues the story. Meanwhile, the litigant, right, that arrogant man, arrived from Nehardea. And that litigant said to Rav Yehuda, here you are. You call me a slave? I, who come from the house of the Hasmonean kings? And now they got him. Rav Yehuda said to him, this is what Shmuel says. Anyone who says, I come from the house of the Hasmonean kings, this is a slave. As will be explained, only slaves remained of their descendants, right? Who are the Hasmonean kings? They're the ones who ascended to the monarchy after the Hanukkah story, right? That was a revolt against Greek, who were the occupying, colonizing force in Israel at the time. They got thrown out. The Hasmoneans became the kings. They were both Kohanim and kings. But eventually that line was decimated. And anyone who says they're a descendant of these people, they're not. And what do we mean by this? Rav Nachman, who heard this exchange, said to Rav Yehuda, does the master not hold in accordance with this law that Rabbi Abba says that Rav Huna says that Rav says? With regard to any Torah scholar who proceeds to teach a ruling of halacha with regard to a particular issue, If he said it before an action that concerns himself occurred, they should listen to him, and his ruling is accepted. But if not, if he quoted the law only after he was involved in an incident related to the law that he is quoting, they do not listen to him due to his personal involvement. Don't you hold by that? And your testimony with regard to what Shmuel ruled with regard to anyone who claims to be a descendant of the Hasmonean kings is actually a slave, you're only raising this law now that you've been challenged by this man. So maybe we can't use your ruling about this, your testimony about this, because you're biased, you're affected by this case. Your testimony with regard to Shmuel, to what Shmuel ruled, should be ignored, as you stated it only after this incident began. Rav Yehuda said to Rav Nachman, well, then go see Rav Matana, who will stand by my report as to what Shmuel ruled. And the Gemara continues, Rav Matana had not seen the city of Nehardea for 13 years, but that very day he arrived. Rav Yehuda said to him, does the master remember what Shmuel said when he was standing with 1 foot on the bank and 1 foot on the ferry? And Rav Matana said to him, certainly, this is what Shmuel said at that time. Anyone who says, I come from the house of the Hasmonean kings, that person is a slave. Why? Because none of them remained except for that young girl who ascended to the roof and raised her voice and said, from now on, anyone who claims I come from the house of the Hasmonean kings, that person is a slave. Other than this girl, the only members of the family who remain were descendants not of the Hasmonean kings, but of Herod. And he was an Edomite slave. And then that girl fell from the roof and died. Presumably, I guess she jumped off, leaving only slaves from the Hasmoneans. With the confirmation of the report of the statement of Shmuel, they also publicized in Nehardea about this arrogant man, that the one who claimed to come from Hasmonean kings, that in fact he was a slave. And the Gemara relates on that day, several marriage contracts were torn up in Nehardea, as many had their marriages annulled after having discovered that they had married slaves. And when Rav Yehuda was leaving Nehardea, they pursued him, seeking to stone him, as because of him it was publicized that their lineage was flawed. And Rav Yehuda said to them, if you are silent, remain silent. And if you will not remain silent, I will reveal about you this statement that Shmuel said. There are 2 lines of offspring in Nehardea. One is called the dove's house, and one is called the raven's house. And your mnemonic with regard to lineages, the impure bird, the raven, is impure, meaning flawed, and the pure one, the dove, is pure, meaning unflawed. And upon hearing this, they threw all those stones that they were intending to stone him with from their hands, as they did not want him to reveal who had a flawed lineage and who didn't. And as a result of all the stones that were thrown into the river that day, a dam arose in the Malka River. I'm almost done, very close. Got just a couple paragraphs, and then I'll take a couple questions. I know the hour is late. And the Gemara continues the discussion of those with flawed lineage. Rav Yehuda proclaimed in Pumbedisa, Ada and Yonasan, known residents of that town, are slaves. Yehuda bar Papa is a mamzer. Bati bar Tuvia, in his arrogance, did not accept a bill of manumission and is still a slave. Rava proclaimed in his city of Mechoza, Bale, Danai, Talai, Malay, Zagai, all of these families are of flawed lineage. Rav Yehuda likewise says, Govai, the inhabitants of a place called Gova, are in fact Gibeonites, and their name has been corrupted. Similarly, those people known as Dorin Unita from the village from the village of the Gibeonites, and they may not marry Jews with unflawed lineage. And Rav Yosef says with regard to this place called Beikuve of Pumbedisa, its residents are all descendants of slaves. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says 400 slaves, and some say 4,000 slaves, were owned by Pashhur ben Immer, a priest in the time of Jeremiah, and due to their greatness, they were assimilated into the priesthood and became known as priests, and any priest who has the trait of insolence is only from them. Abaye said they all sit in rows of honor, and they are in the city of Nehardea. And the Gemara comments, and that statement disagrees with the statement of Rabbi Lazar. As Rabbi Lazar says, if you see an insolent priest, Do not speculate about him that he may be of flawed lineage, since it is stated, for your people are those who strive with the priest, Hosea 4:4, which indicates that priests had a reputation for being cantankerous. Let me just reload the question. So, what do we learn here? First of all, that it's not simple to keep all the various classes, distinct classes of Jews. Normally we just think about, Kohanim, priests, and Levites, and the Yisrael, and we know about mamzers. But then there's other classes as well, disqualified priests, Gibeonites, and former slaves. I mean, that doesn't seem too relevant these days. But spiritually speaking, this idea that one who goes around and he uses the same kind of insult to demean other people, like he is ready to go to that insult, ad hominem attacks, right? A person who is quick to insult others with a particular kind of insult, probably that insult applies to the name caller. Okay, couple questions. Sharon, the mamzer is the result of not just the sin of the mother, but of both the mother and the father, I would think. Absolutely. Right? There's a death penalty offense for both of them. And yeah. I mean, the mamzer is a result of the sin of the two who committed. The married woman and the other man, her paramour, who was not her husband, they conspired to commit that sin together and produced a mamzer, sadly. Bell, perhaps the girl referred to was Mariam, who Herod married as she was the last descendant of the Hasmoneans to solidify his claim on the throne, and Herod later killed I don't know the name of her name, and it's written differently twice here, and I'm just going to blow the name. So was it Mariam or Moam or Mariam? But that woman, right? But this idea, Herod, you go on an archaeological tour of Jerusalem, and you keep hearing that Herod was a builder. This guy had an edifice complex. And he was a great builder, and he really expanded the temple complex in his time. And that wall that we all pray at, that Western Wall, I believe that was built in Herod's time. But perhaps Herod had this complex to overdo it because, his lineage was most definitely flawed and, did not last, right? That was not a monarchy that lasted. And he was a, collaborator with the Romans, etc. There's all kinds of problematic things about Herod. But at any rate, I think that the spiritual lesson is an important one for us. And this idea that, Judaism makes distinctions, and Jews are meant to marry Jews, right? And priests are not meant to marry divorced women. And, why are these the laws? Because God said so. And what's our job? To follow God's law because he said so. That's what I've got for us today. I wish you all a good Shabbos, and let's, wherever level we're at, let's make Shabbos a little bit higher this Shabbos, add to it, maybe bring it in a little early, make sure you're lighting candles, husbands, bring your wife some flowers, anything that we can do to raise the level of our Shabbos adds to the security of Israel, both the Jews in Israel and Jews everywhere. All of us, we need to up our level in this critical time.